Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Mod Driven. Out cruising around in the Honda Civic today. You can probably tell I'm not standing in the garage. I just got done filling up my first half tank of gas. I typically don't go below half a tank. I don't know, old school, I guess. Never want a chance running out of gas. And I'm getting 26.8 miles per gallon and rising. So a heck of a change from my other two vehicles, the Tacoma and the Jeep Gladiator, which, by the way, gets somewhere in the maybe 15 mile per gallon range. So I'm digging that. That's pretty cool. I don't know if you guys can see, but I've got somebody tailgating me here. I guess they're in a hurry. I'll bet you we've got a split in the road coming up here. I'll bet you they take off around me about 90 mile an hour. We'll see. And I'm on a 55 mile an hour road. And I am going 55, so I'm sure they're cussing me out that I'm not driving faster. So I want to talk about the manual transmission. You know, I've had some comments, people asking me, gee, why get a manual? It's so much easier to drive an automatic. You don't have to worry about shifting. I think those people just don't get it. You know, I learned how to drive on a manual transmission, and I have to say, back in the day when I was learning how to drive, I cursed it. I did not like learning how to drive on a manual. I mean, it was hard enough just trying to get used to a great big giant vehicle on the road. Not that that vehicle I was learning on was giant. It was a K car, a Plymouth K car, the worst manual transmission I think I've ever driven. So of course, a great manual transmission to learn how to drive on, because if you could figure out how to drive that car, you can drive any manual transmission, and I've certainly found that to be true. But after learning how to drive it, mastering it, and I will say I've mastered it. I've been driving a manual transmission off and on for decades. Hate to admit that. But they're awesome. They're awesome because they give you control. You know, you can decide when you're going to shift. You know, with the Toyota Tacoma that I have, a lot of people complain about the shifting points in that truck. I mean, almost every video I get, people complain about that. They don't like the points that it shifts at. Now, for me, I've never really noticed any big deal with that. It is an automatic, by the way. I say that because I have had a manual transmission Tacoma, which, by the way, was horrible. Notchy. The reverse was in the wrong place. It just wasn't a real fun truck to drive. I have an automatic now, only because of that. I was disappointed. You know, it seems that since manuals, I do believe, are on their way out, you can't get a regular Honda anymore in a manual transmission. I believe you can still get an SI, but you can't get, for instance, a Civic Coupe. Now, that might be because they've gotten rid of the coupe altogether, so it has nothing to do with the manual. And that's one of the reasons I jumped on this car, is because I wanted a coupe, because I really like the body style, and I wanted a manual transmission. So I had to get a 2020 because that's the last year they made a coupe as far as Honda goes, the last model year. Love the car. It's awesome. Honda does not disappoint when it comes to manual transmissions. It's just as smooth as it was before. It's fun to drive. You can whip through the car, or the gears rather, if you want to, or just take a nice leisurely drive. Now, I've driven other manuals not all that long ago, and I've driven some pretty high-end manuals as well. The high ends, they're so tight and notchy. I mean, you have to be right in the gate to run through those gears. It's not a bad thing. It's just a different driving experience. When you want just a nice smooth ride, the Honda is the way to go. And it's amazing to me that they still maintain, at least up until this point, that type of a transmission. You can tell that they've continued to improve it and made it better over time. Years ago, I think I had an old Honda Civic. It was the hatchback, the really old one. And that transmission, while still was pretty darn decent for the time, was nothing like it is today. Now, there is another reason. Not that it's a big concern for me, but you hear it jokingly all the time. And that is that it's a built-in security feature. And of course that's true, because not a lot of people know how to drive manuals these days. I mean, they're out of vogue. The manufacturers, of course, are not making them anymore, most of them. There's still a handful out there, but people don't know how to drive them, including thieves. So you can be pretty confident when you go and park your manual transmission somewhere that nobody's going to mess with it. You know, I remember there was some story, there have been various stories over the years, but of some attempted carjacking where a guy was going to try to steal a car and he discovered it was a manual and he didn't know how to drive a manual. Of course, it can be bad having manuals when it comes to service work. You know, you would think that it would be a requirement, a prerequisite at a dealership that everybody that comes in there that's going to drive the car, in other words, the service guys, maybe the valets that move them around, those kind of things, that those folks would be able to drive a manual transmission. But I have found that not to be true. I took a car, it was a Honda that I had a few years ago, to a dealership for service or something, and they told me that they had to go get somebody else to pull it in because they didn't know how to drive a manual. I couldn't believe it. I mean, how do you get a job at a car dealership that services manuals and you don't know how to drive one? It just didn't make a lot of sense to me. The other bad area it can be is if you're ever having anybody pick it up and do anything, and I know this isn't really common, but I did have a Honda Civic Sport hatchback a few years ago. It was probably over 4 years ago that I actually had shipped. And when it got to my location, the guy that took it off the truck, probably the guy that drove it on the truck, I don't know, did not know how to drive a manual transmission. So he attempted to. It was about a 5-mile trip to get it to my house from where he was. He attempted to drive the manual transmission, and he ended up smoking my transmission. He ruined it. It was a brand new car. I think I had it like 3 months or something like that. And he ruined the transmission because he probably drove it in first, maybe second gear, I doubt it, for 5 miles. You can't do that. If you're familiar with manual transmissions, then you know you have to shift them. It's bad for the transmission if you don't. It's bad for the engine if you don't. I mean, come on, man. And who in the heck would give a manual transmission to a driver that didn't know how to drive it, knowing that they were going to have to offload the vehicle and deliver it to somebody who paid to have it brought? That really made me angry. Anyway, I didn't keep that car long. I did have it evaluated. I took it into the dealership. They took the cover off and showed me where the transmission had been smoked. Who knows how much longer it would have lasted. There weren't really any symptoms of it other than I could smell a burnt odor inside the car, and that's because they burned up the clutch. Anyway, I just wanted to get on here, talk a little bit about manuals. It's a shame to me that we're losing the manual transmission. I think in the next few years, it's probably going to be gone everywhere. And it's a shame because it is an art and it is a little bit of history, I guess, that's fun to experience. Anyway, leave a comment, let me know. I put a little short up a while ago asking if anybody knew what this was and whether or not they could drive them. And to my surprise, I did get a number of people that said that they do know how to drive manuals. Do you? Also, real quick, I do have 2 additional channels. Rob Motive, all about the Toyota Tacoma, and Rob Motive JT, all about the Jeep Gladiator. Check them out, and if you're interested, why not subscribe? And while you're at it, smash the subscribe button here too. Thanks for watching. Stay safe out there. Bye.